Protect your DNA. BioPQQ can promote formation of new mitochondria. Infowarsstore.com.
It's no longer necessary to try to infer or deduce how global governance is going to come to us. Global redistribution of wealth and a global control is now being presented as it's never been presented before. Never more overtly, never more in the open than it is being done this year with climate change. Now, of course, these people tried 6 years ago at the Copenhagen summit, and they failed. And they've been working on this agenda ever since. Let's take a look at the Earth Statement, and we're going to talk about who this comes from. It says, this is the year of opportunity for a sustainable future. They say 2015 is a critical year for humanity. Our civilization has never faced such existential risks as we are now faced with. And I agree with that, but I disagree that the risk is coming from man-made global warming. It's coming from global governance. But this is how they're going to bring it to us. I've been plotting this for the last 6 years. They say 3 times this year. World leaders will meet to set the course for decades to come. In July 2015, heads of state meet to discuss financing for development. In September 2015, the UN Sustainable Development Goals will be adopted, and they were. We'll talk about those later. In December 2015, which is coming up, 1 month, nations negotiate a new global climate agreement. Decisions made in this single year will be the legacy of our generation. How true. And yet most people don't realize what the purpose of this is or how it is coming to us. It'll probably be enacted just like the Trans-Pacific Partnership by executive decree, pretty much. That's what they've done with the fast tracking of treaties. It'll probably be done during the holiday season so that people don't really look at this. But let's take a look at where this Earth Statement comes from and the man at the center. Look at this picture of the Earth League. This is from an article in May of this year. A call for science-based action. If you look at that picture, you will see Prince Charles at the center. But he's not the man in the center. The man who is really in the center of this is the man that's off to his right. John Schellenhuber, the German scientist. This man is essentially the Henry Kissinger or the Zbigniew Brzezinski of this movement. He is the guy behind all of this. He's put this out. He was at the core of all of the talking points 6 years ago. And now we see this year he has surfaced not as being behind Prince Charles, but really being behind the Pope and behind the Pope's encyclical earlier this summer to push global governance and now redistribution of wealth using government, global government. That's what they're coming at us with in this upcoming conference. Pope Francis appointed a population control extremist to the Vatican post. And this is, again, going back to July. This is the Breitbart article on him. It's nothing but a twist from 2009. It's the same agenda, the same Schellenhuber. This is a guy who is now behind the Pope and not Prince Charles. They need a kindler, gentler face than Prince Charles to sell this, and they need to sell it on a moral authority. But look at what they were selling. This guy, of course, has been appointed to the Pontifical Academy of Science. He was a key writer of this encyclical. He was also one of the 4 official presenters. But back in 2009, at that Copenhagen climate conference that we just talked about, the one that failed to get global governance, he said that we had only the capacity to carry 1 billion people on this planet. So this guy is a radical depopulationist. How are they going to sell a moral agenda? Well, of course, you got to get rid of these people somehow. I thought it was interesting that just this last week, as China got rid of its one-child policy, we had a Boston professor, I mean, where else would they come from? Sarah Conley saying that we need a one-world child policy. And of course, that's what's ultimately going to happen if you pursue a policy of depopulation. That is what these people are after. That is what the Pope has embraced, a one-child policy. And listen to the way she puts this. She says, even having 2 children, the replacement value for the population, as the new Chinese policy allows, is likely to be too many children. By the time the birth rate stabilizes, the global population will be at unsustainable, that's their favorite word, unsustainable, or it is sustainable, unsustainable level, so we don't have a right to so many children. That's what happens when you say that you embrace this Malthusian view of the world, this view of Gaia theory that looks at humans as a virus that's killing the planet. But that's coming from Schellenhuber, the guy who wrote the encyclical for the Pope, the guy who presented the encyclical for the Pope, the guy who is head of his scientific advisory council, the guy who has created all the talking points, the 2% levels, talking about that we are now at the tipping point. But of course, there's another aspect to what Schellenhuber has been pushing, and that is world government. Look at this Catholic publication here, Vox Cantoris. They were concerned about the fact that the Pope was moving towards pushing a world governance. Here's what Schellenhuber talks about, and here's what they had a problem with, because they're Catholics. They want to see the Catholic Church embracing what they believe is the mission of the Catholic Church and not selling a materialistic world government. They say Schellenhuber wishes to influence Canadian Parliament. This guy is in Canada. He says he wants to see a certain percentage of national parliamentary seats earmarked for global ombuds people. And of course, the term is ombudsman, but that's, I guess, not politically correct enough for Schellenhuber. And this is what Schellenhuber said. He said, let me conclude with a daydream about those key institutions that could bring about a sophisticated version of the conventional world government notion. World government notion. Global, and then he inserts the word democracy. There's not going to be democracy in this. But he says global, this one world government, might be organized around three core activities: an Earth Constitution, a global council, a planetary court. I can't discuss these institutions in any detail here. Well, that was 6 years ago. That was at Copenhagen. Now we can see what they are going to do. We have seen the Vatican now calling for a world government, and it is not an inference. It is not anything that we have to imply from this. This is now being explicitly stated. Listen to what the Vatican said. This Pope, these measures ought to be conceived as some of the first steps in view of a public authority with universal jurisdiction. That's world government, folks. As a first stage in a longer effort by the global community to steer its institutions towards achieving the common good. He is selling global governance, global socialism. And he goes on to clarify this. He says the primacy of politics is over the economy and finance. Understand that what he's talking about here is politics over economy, politics over finance, politics over private property, politics over individual rights. That is essentially what he's talking about when he's pushing global socialist world government. Now, the actual agreement, I give credit to the New American for discovering this. This was on October 31st. This is something that came out on Saturday. Stealth agenda, new UN tribunal to judge U.S. for climate debt. And the only thing I disagree with is that it's a stealth agenda. It's not a stealth agenda except to the people who refuse to listen to what's going on. The people who won't pay attention, who are preoccupied with other issues. They point out the official draft text of the climate treaty for the soon-to-start UN climate summit in Paris, that's the one starting in less than a month, proposes to establish a global Supreme Court. There you go. Now we can see how this is going to break down. That would rule on issues like climate justice, climate finance, technology transfers, climate debt. Let me read to you some of the issues from this. Now, this is the actual draft agreement that I'm looking at here. They say, in terms of setting out their goals for this agreement, they want to recognize the intrinsic relationship between climate change, poverty eradication, and sustainable development. In other words, this is a war on poverty effort, always being used to sell a redistribution of wealth. They say they want to emphasize the need for universal sustained action by all to respond to the urgent threat of climate based on the best available scientific knowledge. And of course, they reference the UN IPCC, which has been putting out a lot of non-scientific conclusions based on this information. But let me read to you the actual article where they talk about establishing a world court. When they talk about facilitating implementation and compliance. In other words, how are they going to enforce these things that they agree to in this upcoming climate change? Well, they say they have two options. The second option is, and one of them is kind of a little bit voluntary, but the second option is the one that you need to be concerned about. They say an international tribunal of climate justice as a compliance mechanism hereby established to address cases of non-compliance of the commitments of developed countries in terms of finance, technology, development, and transfer, and the development of an indicative list of consequences taking into account the cause, type, degree, and frequency of non-compliance. In other words, what they're going to do is create a massive bureaucracy, kind of like what we've seen here in the United States with the EPA or the BLM. with the same kind of abuses, but it will be from a global governance standpoint. Now, listen to what they talk about further on when they talk about how this is going to be enacted. They say the composition of the compliance mechanism will be based on geographical representation. It'll have representation of the least developed countries and small island developing states. It will comprise 12 members. Understand, this is going to be a board with 12 members that will rule the world, and that's what they will do. And they will enact their decisions based on a 2/3 majority. They go on to say an enforcement branch will be there for developed countries and a facilitative branch for developing countries. Do you understand the difference? The developed countries are going to get the iron fist. They're going to get enforcement. The developing smaller countries are going to get help. They're going to get facilitation to help them along with this. And that means subsidies. They're going to transfer your wealth. We talked about this as being a redistribution of wealth that's from the richer countries to the poorer countries. That is what this is all about. They say the role of the enforcement branch will be to review compliance and commitments made by the developing countries. The enforcement branch may recommend actions that a developed country party should take. So you're going to get the cops on the developed countries, but the other guys are going to get the soft hand, the subsidy. The role of the facilitative branch will be to assist them in finding ways to incentivize their efforts to meet these commitments. In other words, what we're going to have is an American government that borrows even more money from the banks and then turns it over to these small groups or to the World Bank and then borrows it back again a second time. But we will get the iron fist. And we can see some of these actions coming, and remember there were 3 different things that were coming this year, and of course the one that was just enacted back in September as the Pope was concluding his visit to the United Nations was the resolution adopted by the General Assembly for transforming our world, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And this has a great deal in it. It has already been enacted. They say this agenda is a plan of action for people, planet, and prosperity. It will eradicate poverty in all of its forms. It is the greatest global challenge and an indispensable requirement for sustainable development. And this is for all countries and all stakeholders. And I stop there and I say, wait a minute. All countries, that should be inclusive enough. Why do we have all countries and all stakeholders? Well, folks, because it's the stakeholders, the ones who really own everything, that are going to be making these decisions. It's not going to be global democracy. It is going to be global corporatism. Multinational corporations and the billionaires who control them will be the ones who are calling the shots. They are the stakeholders. You don't have a stake in this future if we don't stop this. They are the stakeholders. And they say the United Nations headquarters in New York on September 25th to the 27th enacted this. They say this is an agenda, and this is their own summary of this. This is an agenda of unprecedented scope and significance. It is accepted by all countries and is applicable to all, taking into account different national realities, capacities, levels of development, etc. These are universal goals and targets which involve the entire world, developed and developing countries alike. They're integrated, indivisible, and they balance the 3 dimensions of sustainable development. This is a global plan. They see that this is really big. It's not getting any coverage in the press. People are not paying any attention to it. And yet we see that the Catholic Church is really the one that is taking the lead under this Pope. We have global bishops who've called for complete decarbonization by 2050. That's not something that's new. That was something that came out of the Copenhagen exchange 6 years ago. What they have done is they are using the Catholic Church and this Pope as the new face to sell this old world agenda. This is what this is. We're going back into the dark ages, back into serfdom. And they point out these bishops are calling for complete decarbonization, no carbon of anything, okay? And they want a drastic reduction in the emission of carbon dioxide and other toxic gases. Folks, carbon dioxide is not a toxic gas. It's breathed out by us. But of course, they can reduce the number of people radically and reduce the amount of carbon. They can reduce our food and reduce the amount of carbon. They can keep us from heating and cooling our homes and kill us off that way, reduce our standard of living, reduce our life expectancy. They can get rid of us that way. They can decarbonize us with that. So the bishops have urged to keep in mind not only the technical, but particularly the ethical and moral dimensions of climate change, because that's the way they're coming at us this year. They say, of course, the disagreements are who should pay for this And how will we make sure that this is enforced? Well, I just read that to you. That's what's coming up at the end of this month. We need to understand what the end game to this is global governance. It's been that for a very long time. In order to sell taxation at a global level, in order to sell a bureaucracy that is going to control everything at a global level, and to establish crony capitalism at a global level, they are telling us that we are facing an urgent threat to our very existence with man-made global warming. So the solution to that is socialism. That's what we see from Bill Gates. We're going to get to that article in just a moment. But let's question this fundamental assumption. Let's be skeptics of the science for one moment here. Let's take a look, for example, at what NASA has just revealed. We see that NASA has just put the lie to the fact that we're told it's a fact, but it's not, that the global polar ice caps are melting. Not true. Only half true. That's the way they manipulate the data. And let's take a close look at how this data has been manipulated. Now, this is a report from Jay Zwally, a glaciologist with NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center. And he says, according to the new analysis of satellite data, the Antarctic ice sheet showed a net gain of 112 billion tons of ice a year from 1992 to 2001. And what he's saying is, we're essentially in agreement with other studies that show an increase in ice discharge. So he says, yeah, there's more ice that's being discharged from the Antarctic, but understand that there's more ice overall. He says the difference is, our main disagreement is for the East Antarctica and the interior of West Antarctica. There we see ice gain that exceeds the losses in other areas. You understand? You have even more ice gain there. So yeah, you're seeing more ice discharged, but the polar bears aren't dying. They're perfectly happy with their situation there, and the ice is actually seeing a net increase. Now, the way some people have spun this, they say other scientists have observed gains in land elevation in East Antarctica, explains NASA, but they've attributed this to snowfall in the region. You see how the data can be manipulated? You see how they can look at the same information, the height of the land, and one of them can say, well, it's snow that's causing it to be that high, but the ice is really melting underneath it. So I'm going to go with my original theory so we can move ahead with global governance. Even though it's increasing in elevation, that's nothing but snow. Nevertheless, Zwally's team used meteorological data dating back to 1979 to show that snow accumulation in East Antarctica has actually been declining, showing that the increase in elevation must be the result then of thicker ice. Do you understand that? Think about that. You got the same data. You can see that it's going up, but of course, the people who are selling us this elaborate lie to justify global governance, global taxation, global bureaucracy, say, oh, it's the snow. NASA came back and said, no, sorry, that doesn't work either, because we've got records showing the snowfall in the Antarctica. But of course, if you question this, you will be facing the worst kind of persecution, the kind of persecution that we haven't seen since the Vatican Scientific Advisory Board was created back with Galileo and Copernicus, when people were vilified, when they lost their living because of the science that they came up with. You can't have a free discussion. You can't have open skepticism that science is based on. Because if you're somebody like Philip Verdier, a household name in France for his daily weather reports, he's actually known as Mr. Weather in France because he is the weatherman on the French channel there, the largest French channel. And he wrote, my book, Climate Investigation, was published 1 month ago. It got me banned from the airwaves, and he was put on leave back on October 12th, and we reported about that. Now the update today is that he has actually been fired. And this is from Climate Depot. He says, I received this letter this morning and decided to open it in front of you because it concerns everybody. In the name of freedom of expression and freedom of information, and I would also say free inquiry, freedom to do science. No, you can't have that because they are going to push this agenda regardless of what the facts say. They're not going to try to debate you. They will silence you. And that should tell you all you need to know about these socialists. He says his book was coming out just weeks before the start of the much anticipated UN Climate Change Summit, which is going to be in Paris. So if it's going to be in Paris, you can't have the main meteorologist in France questioning the fundamental assumptions of global warming, can you? As a matter of fact, it got even worse than that. He wrote his book in response to France's Foreign Minister Laurent Fabius. He met with TV meteorologists and asked them to highlight climate change issues in their broadcasts. He said, I was horrified by this speech. So he wrote this book. saying there's a lot to be skeptical about. And we talked about this in great length when this story first came out. Of course, at that time, he had only been put on a leave of absence. We saw the same thing happening here in Austin at the American Meteorological Society. The only non-scientific exhibitor there was a George Soros Foundation, who were there to tell meteorologists that they needed to push man-made global warming on their audiences. They said, this is horrible. Most meteorologists don't believe this theory. And it's like, yeah, absolutely, because they do science. They create models that they can test, and they're constantly refining those models to try to get more accurate weather predictions. And I imagine it's even harder for them to swallow the idea that somebody can predict the climate decades or centuries in advance of now, when they can't do it with all of their scientific tools a few days in advance as accurately as they would like to do. But of course, today we see that it is really socialism that can save the planet. This is what Bill Gates is telling us. This is an article we have on Infowars.com today. So the world's richest man, Bill Gates, has said that the private sector is too selfish, too inefficient to produce effective energy alternatives to fossil fuel. He says, without a substantial carbon tax, there is no incentive for innovators or for plant buyers to switch. For plant buyers, yeah, okay. So those would be, I guess, the billionaire stakeholders who own everything. Understand that he's pushing exactly the same talking points that we saw being offered by Schellenhuber 6 years ago. He's talking about being fossil-free by 2050. Where did you hear that? Oh, yeah, that's right. The bishops are now pushing that. The global bishops are pushing that for the Catholic Church. Carbon-free by 2050. So is Bill Gates. You see, it's almost as if they got together in a room and created a script, some talking points to convince you that you need a global governance. You know, the bottom line is that everything boils down to being controlled at a single point, because Bill Gates and the other billionaires don't want to have to buy so many different individual politicians. They just like to be able to get one guy at the top. Once they can control him, they can control everything. You know, kind of like one ring to rule them all and in the darkness bind them. I guess we could call him George Sauron, because that's essentially what they're giving us. Now, that is what they're going towards. That is their goal. The way they're going to do that is with redistribution of wealth, to redistribute it at a national level from the wealthy nations to the developing countries.
Break down why you're so proud of these filters.
Well, I mean, the Alexa Pure is really a culmination of all of my experience. It was posed to me as an extremely challenging project. They wanted a product that would actually operate without any electricity, so it had no pressure. You had to do it all by gravity. And they really effectively said, we need everything imaginable to be removed efficiently, way higher than 99%. And so the result was it's an extreme challenge. Worked on it for quite a long time. And basically what we've done is we've created the only filter, to my knowledge, that hits all three. It will remove effectively all the major metals, all the major non-metals such as fluoride. It will take out all known microbiological threats, including viral, bacterial, and cyst. And it will take out organic chemicals of pretty much everything without exception. It's a very, very powerful device. I don't believe that there's anything else out there in the world that can do that, especially under gravity flow conditions. The fit and finish are fantastic. No compromise was made on the quality of the construction. So, I mean, it's really a remarkable achievement on their part, and I feel very proud, actually, to be part of the team that put that together.
What's your view overall on fluoride?
Well, okay, so we actually tested against both the fluoride ion and the fluorosilicate that you mentioned, which is the additive that people put into water under federal control. And basically, we removed both of them with equal efficiency. So we wanted to be sure that no matter how fluoride is added to the water, it can be intercepted and removed. So that's how we've dealt with that. All I can tell you is that we tested against all known fluoride chemicals that are added to water, the new ones and the old ones, and we removed them all of equal efficiency. And
it's your belief that this is the best gravity-fed filter of the design out there available to the public?
Without a doubt. I mean, most of these gravity flow filters are at best simple particulate filters. They remove dirt and debris, sediment. They're not going to be capable of intercepting a viral particle to the degree we're talking quantitative reduction below detection. No one can touch that kind of capability.
Well, I'm impressed, and I want to thank you so much for your time today. It is the Alexa Pure Pro family of water filtration systems available, discounted exclusively at InfoWarsStore.com. I want to thank Mr. Redhawk for allowing us to be part of the launch of this. It's on sale right now for their main unit, $177. Leading competitors that aren't even as good are more than that. And they've also got the survival spring type straw system for survival that is an absolute must-have.